The Negev desert does not whisper its secrets. It screams them on the scorched wind, in a silence so profound it presses against the ear. This is a place where time does not flow, but congeals, layer by layer, in sandstone and granite. For 3 millennia, these lifeless hills have guarded a truth capable of shattering the very foundations of history. We have come to know King Solomon as a figure of parable and legend, a sage of impossible wisdom, a builder of magnificent, almost mythical structures. But what if these legends were not fables? What if they were the misunderstood echoes of a real, staggering technology? What if the magic of Solomon was not mysticism, but a rigorous science, one that outpaced its era by centuries, only to be lost in the ensuing darkness? Last October, deep in the Timna Valley, a place known to tourists as King Solomon's Mines, an archaeological expedition encountered an anomaly that defied every textbook. It was not the gold that treasure hunters covet. It was not precious stones. It was an object that should not have existed in that stratum of time. A lead scroll. Sealed, flattened by the colossal pressure of ages, and crusted with a patina of toxic oxides. It lay within a hidden chamber, hewn from bedrock at a depth of 15 meters. This was no mere artifact. It was the black box of an ancient world, a time capsule sent from an epoch we had dismissed as primitive. And when scientists finally peered inside, using advanced imaging to read its text without breaking the ancient seal, the words that emerged from the darkness brought their work to a stunned halt. The discovery began not with the scrape of a trowel, but with the high-frequency pulse of ground-penetrating radar. The Tel Aviv University expedition, under the direction of Professor Erez Ben Yosef, was conducting a routine scan of a sector long considered exhausted and empty. The area was known as the Hill of the Slaves, where historians believed common laborers had simply toiled and died. But the instruments revealed a strangeness that forced the operator to reboot the system twice. 15 meters down, the radar signal had faltered, reflecting off something unnaturally dense, too geometrically perfect for a natural formation, too deep for any common grave or shaft. When the heavy drilling rig finally penetrated the rock shelf, its diamond-tipped bit broke with a characteristic shriek. It had not struck granite. It had struck a history we were never meant to find. A history that proves the past is never truly past. It is merely buried, waiting for a signal to call it back from oblivion. The drill bit screamed against something unyielding. Not bedrock, fractured and familiar, but a smooth, impossibly hard surface. An artificial composite. An ancient concrete. On-site chemical analysis of the shavings delivered a startling confirmation. The material was rich with volcanic ash, a pozzolana identical to the kind the Romans would later master, the secret ingredient in the enduring majesty of their pantheon and the deep water foundations of their ports. But this concrete was poured 800 years before the founding of Rome. It was the first signal that the known history of this place was about to be fractured. Who, in the 10th century before our era, possessed the knowledge of hydraulic concrete engineering, and why would they employ it in the middle of a waterless desert? The source of the anomaly was a sarcophagus. When the moment finally came to break the seal, the team braced for the rush of stale subterranean air. But nothing escaped. No sound, no breath of decay. The chamber was a vacuum, a silence of 3 millennia, perfectly preserved. The ancient engineers had performed an almost unimaginable feat. They had deliberately purged the oxygen from the chamber before its final hermetic sealing, a desperate measure to ensure the survival of its contents at any cost. Inside, resting on a crude basalt pedestal, lay the prize. A scroll. It was not papyrus, which would have crumbled to dust at the first touch of air. Not parchment, nor inscribed copper. It was lead. 50 kilograms of pure elemental lead, rolled into a tight, massive cylinder. Lead, the metal of Saturn, the metal of the alchemists, the same dense, heavy metal we use today as our ultimate shield against the invisible poison of radiation. The paradox was immediate and profound. Why record information on a material so difficult to process, so impossible to inscribe with conventional ink, and so punishingly heavy to transport? The answer could only be one of absolute necessity. This information was deemed so critical, so essential, that it had to be engineered to survive fire, flood, earthquake, and the slow, grinding erosion of time itself. This discovery was made in the Timna Valley, a lifeless Martian panorama in the south of Israel. Here, the daytime temperature climbs to 45 degrees Celsius in the slivers of shade that offer little relief. It was in this unforgiving landscape, in the middle of the 20th century, that the archaeologist Nelson Gluck first uncovered traces of massive-scale copper mining. For decades, academic consensus dismissed them as primitive pits, dug by Egyptians during the age of the early dynasties. But new methods of dating, applied by a modern team, overturned the entire chronology. The peak of industrial activity, the moment of greatest output, was not in the age of the pharaohs. It was precisely in the 10th century before our era, the age of Solomon. Yet the discovery of the lead scroll elevated the significance of these mines from a regional operation to something of global importance. The first question that confronted the scientists was one of provenance. Where did this metal come from? Lead is not mined in Timna. Its ores are not found in the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Isotopic analysis, conducted in the laboratories of Oxford with a precision that could distinguish the origin of individual atoms, delivered a result that forced historians of economic geography to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The ore was not from local mines. It was not from Cyprus, nor from Anatolia. Its chemical fingerprint pointed to a single astonishing source: the island of Sardinia, a distance of more than 2,500 kilometers across the open sea. In the 10th century before our era, this single data point implies something revolutionary. It means that Solomon possessed more than just the trading fleet mentioned in passing in the biblical texts. It suggests he commanded a regular, heavy tonnage cargo line connecting the eastern Mediterranean with Western Europe. This single scroll begins to redraw the entire map of the ancient economy. We have long considered the Phoenicians to be the undisputed masters of the seas, but the chemical composition of this artifact suggests that Solomon was not merely their client. He was the primary driver, the chief investor in these ambitious, long-range expeditions. Lead was a strategic resource, and it was being moved by the ton across the known world to this remote desert outpost. The evidence is irrefutable. The question that remains is the one that echoes from the vacuum-sealed tomb. Why? The answer, as it so often does, lay hidden from the naked eye, concealed within the microscopic topography of the scroll's surface. Under immense magnification, a story began to emerge, written not in ink, but in elements. Traces of mercury, and beside them, sulfur. To the modern mind, they are mere entries on a periodic table, but to the ancient world, they were the keys to transformation, the essential components of amalgamation, a process used to extract gold from ore, and perhaps for primitive galvanic processes that bordered on the arcane. Here, on the precipice of a revelation, a radical hypothesis took form. What if the legendary gold of Solomon was not simply mined and hammered into shape? What if it was chemically purified, its brilliance enhanced, its value magnified by technologies we long believed were the exclusive discovery of the industrial age? But the scroll itself guarded its secrets with an impassable defense. To physically unroll the leaden artifact was an impossibility. Over 3,000 years, the metal had undergone a slow, inexorable crystallization. It had become brittle, its molecular structure as fragile as a desiccated biscuit. Any mechanical attempt to unfurl it would not reveal its text, but annihilate it, shattering the priceless document into a worthless handful of metallic dust. The inscription would be lost forever. The artifact was immediately sealed within a specialized container, its delicate form cushioned by a bath of inert gas, and dispatched on a pilgrimage to the heart of European science. Its destination, Grenoble, France, home to the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility. This is no mere laboratory, it is a cathedral of modern physics, a colossal ring where particles are accelerated to near the speed of light, generating X-ray beams millions of times more brilliant than the sun. The plan was to deploy a technique known as virtual unwrapping, a digital miracle that had already rescued the charred scrolls of Ein-Gedi and the carbonized papyri of Herculaneum from oblivion. But here, the technology faced an unprecedented challenge. Papyrus and parchment are ghosts to an X-ray beam, allowing it to pass through. Lead is a fortress. It absorbs radiation, acting as a shield. The scroll was, in effect, blind to the very light meant to read it. Engineers were forced to push the synchrotron to the very edge of its energetic capacity, employing ultra-high-resolution tomography to pierce the metallic veil. For 600 continuous hours, the machine worked, relentlessly bombarding the artifact with photons. Computers churned through terabytes of data, digitally slicing the scroll layer by layer, voxel by voxel, attempting to separate one metallic curl from the next on a monitor screen. It was a task of surgical precision, a high-stakes gamble where a single error in a mathematical algorithm could collapse the ancient text into a cascade of meaningless digital noise. Then, as the first coherent images began to resolve on the high-resolution displays, a profound silence fell over the laboratory. The assembled scientists had expected to see ritualistic symbols, perhaps a zodiacal chart or a list of offerings to forgotten gods. They saw a table, rigid, orderly columns of letters and numbers. This was not a religious text. It was an accounting ledger and a complex cipher. The script was Paleo-Hebrew, the most ancient form of the alphabet, the ancestor of the modern language. But the grammar was unnervingly strange. Words were truncated, stripped of their endings. The phrases were constructed in a clipped, telegraphic, almost military style. There was none of the poetry of the Psalms, none of the ornate lyricism of the Song of Songs, or the wisdom of Proverbs. It was a language that was dry, hard, and ruthlessly technical. Linguists, summoned for an emergency analysis, were initially convinced they were looking at an elaborate forgery. The syntax seemed too modern, too bureaucratic to belong to the Bronze Age. But then came the final, irrefutable truth. Radiocarbon dating, performed on microscopic organic fibers that had been accidentally trapped within the lead oxide as the scroll was rolled shut, confirmed the date beyond all doubt. 960 to 980 years before the Common Era, plus or minus 30 years. The very zenith of King Solomon's reign. The past, it seems, is not always written in the soaring language of prophets and poets. Sometimes it is encoded in the cold, efficient language of industry and administration. And we are forced to confront the unsettling possibility that ancient civilizations were not just empires of faith and force, but also of meticulous calculation, their secrets locked away not in tombs, but in spreadsheets of lead, awaiting a light bright enough to read them. The first deciphered transmission was cold, clinical, and utterly cryptic. A report on a delivery from Ophir. Sector 04. Losses acceptable. The cargo is delivered. The name, Ophir, resonates through the annals of history, a whisper in the ear of theologians' anchories. Its true location has remained one of humanity's great unsolved mysteries. with theories pointing to the distant shores of Africa, the coasts of India, or even the forgotten continents of South America. But this ancient ledger was no treasure map for adventurers. It was a technical manifest, and the cargo it detailed was far more precious and infinitely more dangerous than simple gold. The text employed a specific Hebrew term, Kaveth. While it translates literally as heavy, in the context of this document, it signified not physical weight, but a substance of immense consequence. The scroll spoke of stones that burn, but are not consumed. It described materials that induced a sickness of the very bones, a strange malady that caused the hair to fall from those who handled the shipment. It is an unmistakable, chillingly precise description of acute radiation syndrome, etched into a record 3,000 years old. This was a fact from which history could not simply turn away. And yet, this was merely the prelude. The most sensational, the most volatile revelation concerned the infamous Goetia, the medieval tradition of magic detailing 72 demons which King Solomon had supposedly sealed in a brass vessel and compelled to serve him. Historians had long dismissed the tales as a cultist fantasy, a medieval fable spun from superstition. But the lead scroll contained a list, and on that list, the familiar infernal names appeared, one after another. Asmodeus, Belial, Astaroth, Marcosius. These were not, however, the names of horned beasts or entities from the abyss. They were call signs, code names for the highest echelons of a vast, sophisticated operation. They were the designations for chief engineers of advanced corps, for the shadowy heads of intelligence networks, for the powerful curators of industrial zones. What has been called Solomon's magic was, in truth, the single greatest administrative and technological reform in ancient history. Consider the demon Agares. The grimoires describe him as an old man riding a crocodile, a being who could force fugitives to return and who knew all the languages of the world. In the Leaden Report, Project Agares is revealed to be the designation for a dual-purpose agency, an internal security service and a corps of translators. Their mandate was to track down runaway skilled laborers from secret mines and to interrogate foreign envoy Iptian mercenaries. Then there is Marcosius, the great warrior of legend, appearing as a wolf that spews fire from its maw. The scroll reveals that codename Marcosius concealed an elite assault division armed with terrifyingly advanced weaponry, early prototypes of Greek fire. These were incendiary mixtures based on crude petroleum and saltpeter harvested from the Dead Sea region. King Solomon possessed flamethrowers. This singular fact explains why neighboring, far larger kingdoms feared to attack the small nation of Israel. The psychological terror of these fire wolves was a deterrent more potent than any conventional army. Technological dread was the bedrock of deterrence. The demon Stolas, described as a teacher of astronomy and an icon for a pantheon of hell, was in fact a cabinet of ministers, a general staff, a directorate of science. The line between magic and technology, between demonology and bureaucracy, is merely a veil of time and misunderstanding. It forces us to wonder what other myths, what other gods and monsters are not fantasies of the supernatural, but the faded, distorted records of a human history far more advanced than we have ever dared to imagine. In official records, he is listed as the head of the Department of Navigation and Pharmacology. This was the office of Stolas, the entity responsible for calculating the star charts that guided fleets across vast, unknown oceans to the legendary lands of Tarshish and Ophir. Here, the ancient lexicon begins to shift. To command demons in the language of that era was not an act of sorcery. It was to command a colossal, sprawling machine of bureaucracy and military industry, a machine so ruthlessly efficient, so profoundly secretive that to the common man, its workings were indistinguishable from the supernatural. King Solomon was no magician wielding a wand. He was the chief executive officer of the first transnational corporation in human history. The scroll, a text of chilling modernity, details the methods by which his absolute power was maintained. Within its pages is an extensive section devoted to what is called the whisper wind system. It is not a spell, but a blueprint for an advanced network of acoustic surveillance. Solomon's great temple and palace complex were not constructed merely as monuments to faith and power. Their very architecture was engineered to function as a gigantic listening ear. A hidden system of hollow ceramic tubes, ventilation shafts and resonators, all calibrated to the precise frequency of the human voice, snaked through the thickness of the walls. This network allowed whispers from the most distant reception chambers and corridors to be channeled to a central point. The legend that the birds of the air carried news to the king finds its terrifying physical embodiment here. The birds were not feathered creatures, but listening officers, intelligence agents stationed in secret rooms, transcribing the clandestine conversations of ambassadors and nobles. In light of these revelations, archaeologists are urgently re-examining excavation plans in Jerusalem, searching for the physical traces of these acoustic channels, the silent witnesses to an empire built on secrets. Even more astonishing is the scroll's description of the kingdom's water supply. It speaks of subterranean rivers flowing upwards, a phrase long dismissed as poetic metaphor. For centuries, it was believed the Romans were the unrivaled masters of the aqueduct. But this text reveals that Solomon's engineers had mastered the principle of the siphon and the complexities of high-pressure hydraulics fully half a millennium before Rome laid its first stone arch. They turned the desert into a garden, not through prayer, but through the precise calculation of water pressure in sealed conduits of lead and ceramic. This alone explains the fabled wealth of the kingdom. In the unforgiving arithmetic of the desert, water is a currency more precious than gold. He who controls the water controls the very life and death of his subjects. When linguists superimposed the geographical data from the scroll onto a map of the ancient world, the scale of the operation was breathtaking. The network of demons, the trade agents and fortified factoria, spanned a territory that dwarfed the biblical kingdom of Israel. The text mentions regular contact with the Tin people in the far west, a near certain reference to the British Isles of Cornwall or the Iberian Peninsula. It speaks of the Silk people in the east, thousands of years before the official opening of the Great Silk Road. Solomon had forged a prototype of a global economic network, its arteries stretching across continents. Finally, the scroll mercilessly tears away the romantic veil from the story of the Queen of Sheba. In the Bible and the Quran, it is a beautiful tale of wisdom, riddles, and mutual admiration. The scroll presents a different reality, one stripped of poetry and laid bare by the cold calculus of power. The past, it seems, is a foreign country, governed by laws we have forgotten. We have mistaken the mechanisms of immense power for magic, the efficiency of a surveillance state for divine omniscience, and the reach of a global enterprise for a legion of spirits. History is not always a story of gods and monsters, but of systems and control, and the most potent miracles are often just technology, wielded by a will that is absolute. In the dry, meticulous report of Belial, the curator of foreign policy, there is no mention of poetry or romance. What is chronicled instead are the brutal mechanics of power. Tense, complex trade negotiations for the division of spheres of influence. At the heart of this geopolitical struggle was the Sabaean kingdom, a remote and powerful realm that held a global monopoly on frankincense and myrrh. In the ancient world, these were not mere fragrances. They were commodities more precious than gold, the lifeblood of ritual and medicine. The ruler of this kingdom, known to history as the Queen of Sheba, or Makeda, did not journey to Jerusalem to be dazzled by wisdom. the scroll paints a far more desperate picture. She came to save her nation from economic ruin. A naval blockade, orchestrated by King Solomon's fleet in the Red Sea, was slowly strangling her country, cutting off its primary artery to the world. Her visit was not an act of admiration, it was an act of capitulation. And the fabled wisdom of Solomon, so celebrated in Scripture, is revealed here in a harsher light. It was not the wisdom of parables and gentle riddles, but the cold, cynical pragmatism of a master statesman. He did not pose puzzles. He dictated the terms of tariffs and duties. His court was not a forum for intellectual debate, but a chamber where the price of a nation's survival was calculated to the last shekel. The agreement forged between them went beyond mere commerce. A crucial clause in the scroll speaks of a merging of blood. This was no clandestine affair. It was the blueprint for a dynastic marriage, a sacred and binding guarantee that the contract would be honored. The son of Solomon and Makeda, Menelik, a figure of immense importance in Ethiopian legend, appears in this context not as a child of love, but as a political asset. He was a living seal on their treaty, a royal hostage ensuring generations of peace and compliance. Yet it is in the final, heavily damaged portion of the scroll, where the outer layers of lead have succumbed to the ravages of time, that the most unsettling revelation emerges. It is a single word: shamir. In rabbinic literature and the Midrash, the shamir is a thing of myth, a mystical worm or a stone the size of a barley grain, possessing the power to cut through any material. It was the tool said to have shaped the stones of Solomon's temple, allowing its construction to proceed without the profane clang of iron hammers, without sound, and without dust. For centuries, this was believed to be a metaphor for divine assistance, a symbol of God's invisible hand at work. The scroll, however, offers no such poetry. It provides a dry, technical description that would make a modern engineer applaud. The shamir was not a living creature, it was a technology, a sophisticated method of abrasive cutting. The text describes the use of a fine powder, reeflands of India or Africa. This abrasive powder was applied to the edges of rotating copper discs or bronze saws. As the disc spun, lubricated by a constant flow of water and oil, it could slice through the most obdurate granite and basalt with the precision of a laser. This was the secret to the silent cutting. The ritual prohibition against the sound of shattering stone was paramount, for such noise was considered a desecration of the holy sanctuary. But beneath the religious doctrine lay a starkly pragmatic reason. The dust of chiseled stone, rich in silica, was a killer. Stonemasons of the ancient world, working with primitive tools, were doomed to die from silicosis of the lungs within a few short years. The wet, abrasive cutting of the shamir was a clean process. It preserved the lives of the highly skilled, irreplaceable master craftsmen. Solomon, the great king, was simply taking care of his most valuable personnel. But there is a more frightening hypothesis. The scroll offers one final, chilling detail. It mandates that the shamir must be stored in a lead vessel, its interior lined with wool. It speaks of those who handle it with unprotected hands, suffering from ulcers and a horrific rotting of the flesh. This has led some scientists to a bold and terrifying suggestion. Could ancient geologists, prospecting in the desert, have stumbled upon a natural source of concentrated radiation? A fragment of high-grade uranium ore, or even radium? The ancient descriptions of a substance that glows in the dark and a mysterious illness that causes hair to fall out align with unnerving accuracy to the classic symptoms of acute radiation sickness. Was this strange power used for cut-ins fallen to Earth? Or perhaps it was something far more sinister, a tool of ultimate elimination, a silent and invisible instrument of a king who understood that the greatest power is that which is never seen, only felt. The Ark of the Covenant. an object so sacred, so charged with divine power, that to touch it was to invite instant death. For millennia, this has been understood as a testament to the awesome power of God. But a new, more sinister physical meaning now emerges from the shadows of the past. If the vessel truly contained a radioactive element, a fragment of a meteorite, a potent natural isotope, then the swift deaths of those who laid a hand upon it were not a matter of divine retribution, but of the cold, immutable laws of physics. This stark reinterpretation forces us to look again at an age we have long idealized, a time we imagine as green and ecologically pure. A recently deciphered scroll, however, shatters this pastoral illusion. Within its brittle pages, the reports of ancient smoke wardens contain terrifying data, revealing an environmental catastrophe on a regional scale. To smelt copper in the furnaces of the Timna Valley required a colossal, almost unimaginable quantity of charcoal. The scroll documents royal decrees ordering the systematic, clear-cutting of forests across vast territories. The Negev desert, we now understand, was not born of nature. It was forged in the fires of ancient industry. What was once a green and vibrant valley was rendered a dead wasteland in the 10th century before the Common Era. But a horror deeper than ecological ruin was unfolding. The local copper ore was rich in arsenic. As it was heated in the smelting pits, it released clouds of poisonous vapor that hung heavy over the landscape. The men who toiled in this haze, long thought to be slaves, are given a more haunting name in the scroll: the people of short breath. They died young, not from the sting of the whip, but from a slow, creeping death delivered by the very air they breathed, a heavy metal poisoning that ravaged their bodies from within. And the scroll reveals a chilling truth. King Solomon knew. Preserved in the text are cynical economic calculations, a cold calculus of human life. The cost of training a new smelter is weighed directly against the brutally short term of his service. A special diet was mandated. The workers received generous rations of red meat, wine, and pistachios. This was not an act of benevolence. It was a calculated strategy. Protein and fat-rich foods slow the body's absorption of toxins. It was a method to prolong a worker's usefulness, to wring a few more years of labor from a man already condemned. This was not compassion. It was cold, ruthless resource management, maximizing the output of a human component one knew to be disposable. Within this brutal context, even sacred scripture takes on a new, pragmatic light. The biblical plea, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean," has always been perceived as a spiritual metaphor for repentance. The scroll, however, exposes its starkly biological purpose. A significant section is dedicated to the purification of the labor camps. With thousands of workers living in crowded, squalid conditions, the threat of an epidemic was more terrifying than any war. Solomon instituted the most stringent sanitary protocols. The hyssop of the Bible, now identified as a potent species of oregano, contains powerful natural antimicrobial oils, chiefly carvacrol. The scroll commands not a gentle ritual sprinkling, but the regular forced disinfection of all living quarters, clothing and tools with a concentrated extract of hyssop mixed with vinegar. It is effectively the first documented use of a chemical antiseptic on an industrial scale in human history. A medical corps, led by a figure later demonized in grimoires as the great healer Baal, conducted ruthless triage. The infected were not cared for. They were immediately isolated in quarantine caves, sealed off from the main camp. Any who tried to conceal their sickness or break the quarantine were subject to execution. Cruel, without question, but these measures saved the kingdom from the devastating plagues of cholera and pestilence that were leveling neighboring civilizations. The ancient world was not a simpler time. It was a crucible of brilliance and brutality, where profound spiritual belief existed alongside a terrifyingly pragmatic understanding of the material world. It was an era where knowledge was power, and survival for king and kingdom demanded a heavy price. A price paid in the ashes of forests and in the short, poisoned breath of forgotten men. The medicine of Solomon was never for the soul of one man, but for the survival of an entire nation. When the first deciphered reports from a long-hidden lead scroll were published, they did not merely cause a stir, they ignited a tempest in the quiet halls of academia. Traditional biblical scholarship recoiled in a fury of denial. Its proponents argue that the translation is a wild, undisciplined interpretation, that the text's technical terms are nothing more than elaborate allegories. They insist that where the scroll reads heavy, it simply means important. Where it speaks of burning, it is merely a metaphor for the wrath of God. But a different school of thought, populated by physicists, metallurgists, and engineers, holds its ground. The text, they contend, is far too technical, too granular to be a work of poetic fiction. It contains specific figures. It details volumes in tons and delivery schedules measured in days. It describes a system of logistics so complex it would rival a modern corporation. One cannot, they argue, metaphorically dispatch 200 talents of refined ore through the port of Ezion-Geber. An event of this magnitude either happened or it did not. At a closed conference, Professor of Archaeology James Tabor stated it plainly. "We were searching for a holy prophet," he confessed. "Instead, we found a brilliant engineer and a ruthless politician." This revelation does not diminish the grandeur of Solomon. On the contrary, it makes him terrifyingly real. A man of flesh and blood whose intellect was a force of nature. While the academic world wages its war of words, the Vatican maintains an official stony silence. Yet, insiders whisper of urgent activity within the apostolic archives, of a frantic re-examination of ancient texts previously dismissed as heretical or apocryphal. The unsettling possibility arises that the Church has always known, that it has guarded this truth for millennia, concealing it to preserve a canonical, more palatable image of a king who spoke only in parables. This begs the question, why did these incredible technologies disappear? Why was this knowledge buried so deep, sealed so securely within a scroll of lead? The final, chilling section of the text illuminates the twilight of Solomon's reign. The empire, a marvel built on hyper-efficiency, was beginning to fracture under its own weight. Taxes were exorbitant. The populace groaned, exhausted by endless construction projects and a relentless push toward industrialization. But the principal threat was gathering beyond the borders. To the south, Egypt was stirring. Pharaoh Shoshenq I, the biblical Shishak, was preparing a massive invasion, his eyes fixed on his neighbor's trade routes and, more importantly, the source of his technological supremacy. Solomon, the ultimate strategist, understood the stakes. If these tools, the flamethrowers, the cryptographic maps, the chemical formulae, were to fall into enemy hands, the world would plunge into an age of unparalleled chaos. Egypt would become an invincible monster. And so, the scroll details an order, a directive that can only be described as an oblivion protocol. It was a command for systematic self-liquidation. The engineers, the architects of his power, were dismissed, sent into exile, or eliminated. The secret mines were filled in, their entrances erased from memory and maps. The intricate systems of hydraulics and acoustics within the temple itself were dismantled, or cleverly disguised as simple ritual objects, their true functions stripped away. The lead scroll is what remained. It is a backup, a final, desperate copy of knowledge, created by a small group of loyal technocrat priests in the last days before the catastrophe. They understood that a dark age was descending. They sought to preserve a single flicker of knowledge for a future generation, hoping that one day their descendants would be wise enough to wield it for the betterment of all. A single phrase echoes across the centuries. a direct message to our time. Seal this until the time when men learn to hear stone and see through metal. It is a message for an age of seismic sensors and X-ray scanners, an age of computers and quantum physics. It is a message for us. The discovery of this scroll does not merely change our understanding of the past. It forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of knowledge and to ask what secrets we, in our own time, might choose to bury. We have grown accustomed to a comforting narrative of history, a straight and steady ascent from the stone axe to the smartphone. We see ourselves at the pinnacle, the inevitable result of millennia of upward momentum. But a discovery, unearthed from the ancient mines of Timna, suggests a far more unsettling reality. It tells us that progress is not a straight line, but a treacherous spiral, and sometimes a path that breaks and falls back into darkness. It whispers that we have stood at this summit before, and we fell. The technologies of the Age of Solomon were not forgotten because they were flawed. They were abandoned for their terrible success. They were lost because the society that wielded them could not bear their social and moral price. The Bronze Age collapsastrophe that hurled civilization back 1,000 years. The great aqueducts, arteries of life, choked on silt and neglect. The resonant acoustic systems, capable of carrying a voice across entire cities, fell silent. And the names of the great engineers, the architects of this lost golden age, were twisted and warped by time, surviving only as the names of demons and malevolent spirits in the folklore of a shattered world. The legendary Book of Solomon was never a grimoire of black magic. It was something far more potent, an operating manual for a highly advanced state, a blueprint for a society of breathtaking complexity. The failure to understand it was ours alone. For centuries, we searched its legacy for miracles when we should have been looking for schematics. Now, the lead scroll from Timna resists us. Its final pages, exposed to some ancient, intense heat, have fused into a monolithic core, a solid lump of metal and meaning that even our most powerful synchrotrons cannot fully pierce. It holds its deepest secrets in a leaden silence. Yet, on the very edge of this unreadable heart, the last legible section contains a list of coordinates. Most point to familiar ruins, the ghosts of cities and fortresses long surrendered to the desert sands. But one coordinate, meticulously corrected for 3 millennia of magnetic drift and the slow, inexorable crawl of tectonic plates, points to a single, impossible location, the very heart of Jerusalem. It lies deep beneath the layers of the modern city, buried under centuries of faith and conflict. It is a zone rendered utterly inaccessible to excavation, a nexus of religious and political fault lines where the shovel is a more provocative tool than the sword. The ancient text gives this place a name, a title that resonates with mythic power: the repository of the first light. What lies dormant in that sanctified earth? A working prototype of the shamir, the legendary device said to cut stone as if it were clay. A complete library of forgotten engineering schematics. A cache of the fabled burning metal, a power source lost to time. Or is it something else? Something our own age of atomic power and artificial intelligence is not yet prepared to comprehend, let alone control. The silence from the scientific community is deafening, paralyzed by the fear of political provocation. Religious leaders, hearing whispers of this discovery, demand all inquiry be forbidden, seeking to protect a fragile peace. And so, the lead scroll waits. Sealed within an armored vault in Europe, it continues to radiate its silent, potent threat. We have deciphered the words, but have we understood the warning? The ancients knew what we are only beginning to relearn, that knowledge is not merely power. It is a weight, a burden heavy enough to crush the civilization that unearths it. The lead scroll from Timna is not a window into the past. It is a mirror, and staring back from its burnished surface is not the face of an ancient people in sandals, but the reflection of our own world. A world of global corporations, of relentless struggles for resources, of ecological tipping points, and the terrible promise of dual-use technologies. Solomon was the first to build such a world. He was also the first to witness its profound fragility. The deciphering continues. Each week, computer algorithms wrest new lines of text from the silent lead, revealing another verse in this ancient drama. But we are only at the beginning of understanding the true nature of the power this man once commanded. As we unearth the secrets of a king who lived 3,000 years ago, we are forced to confront the unsettling possibility that the future he warned of is already here. History is not a static record etched in stone. It is a living narrative being written at this very moment, the ink still wet upon the page. Perhaps some secrets are best left to the earth, buried forever beneath layers of time and dust. But human curiosity has always been a force more potent than fear. Imagine then if our species were to gain access to a vault of the first light, a repository of primordial knowledge. Would it prove to be our greatest endowment, or would it herald the beginning of the end for our age? The story of humanity is a colossal puzzle, and in its telling, the line between enlightenment and annihilation remains terrifyingly thin.